The sun rose slowly over the wide, empty land. Morning light spread across the dry fields like golden paint on an endless canvas. It was quiet, except for the wind moving through the tall grass and the sound of a horse walking slowly on the dirt road. The ranch stretched out for miles, a lonely piece of land far away from the busy towns. Only one man lived there, Jack Hensley, a man known for his hard work, silent nature, and eyes that had seen more pain than most people ever would. Jack had lived alone for many years. The ranch had belonged to his father and before that to his grandfather. Life here was simple but tough. He woke up before sunrise every day, fed the horses, fixed fences, checked the cattle, and worked until the sun went down. He didn't talk much, didn't have many friends, and kept his heart locked away like a barn door in winter. People in town often said he was made of stone, but that wasn't true. Inside, Jack was tired of loneliness. He had no one to talk to at night, no one to laugh with, no one to share a meal with when the day ended. Years ago, he had hoped for a different life. He had dreamed of a wife, a family, and warm voices filling the house. But life hadn't been kind to him. His parents passed away when he was young, and the woman he once loved chose to marry someone else, a man with more money and a bigger ranch. Jack had buried his pain deep inside, deciding that life was easier when he didn't hope for too much. But now, everything was about to change. 3 months earlier, Jack had made a decision that surprised even himself. In a small, dusty office in town, he signed a paper that connected him to a name he had never heard before. A woman from a faraway land. She had lost everything, and her only hope was to come to America. Jack didn't know her face, didn't know her story. All he knew was that he could offer her shelter, food, and safety. And maybe she could offer him company and a little light in the dark corners of his world. The train whistle broke the quiet of that morning. It echoed across the fields, reaching Jack's ears as he stood by the fence, his hat pulled low to block the sun. He felt a strange feeling in his chest, a mix of fear, excitement, and something else he couldn't name. He wasn't a man used to change, but today, change was coming whether he was ready or not. At the train station, people were moving in all directions. Men carried bags, women held children, and the air was full of the sound of steam and wheels. Jack stood near the platform, his hands inside his coat pockets. He scanned the crowd, unsure who he was looking for. Then he saw her. She stood near the end of the platform, small and quiet, holding a single brown suitcase. Her black hair was tied back neatly, and her dark eyes looked both scared and strong at the same time. She wore a simple dress, not new but clean. She looked like someone who had known sorrow, but also someone who had learned how to survive. Her name was Mei Lin. She noticed him too. A tall, broad-shouldered man with sun-browned skin, wearing a worn hat and boots. He looked serious, almost cold, but there was something kind hidden in the way he stood, a quiet strength. For a moment, they just stared at each other, two strangers whose lives were now tied together by a decision made far away. Jack walked toward her slowly. "Mei Lin?" he asked in a low, steady voice. She nodded carefully. "Yes, you, Jack?" Her English was soft, careful, but clear enough to understand. He nodded. "That's right." For a second, neither of them spoke. The noise of the train station surrounded them like a wave, but they stood still in the middle of it. Jack wasn't a man of many words, and Mei Lin wasn't sure what she was supposed to say to a man who had brought her here. Finally, he picked up her suitcase with one hand, his movements firm but not rough. "We should go," he said. She followed him quietly. The wagon ride from the station to the ranch took almost 2 hours. The land stretched endlessly in every direction. Brown earth, dry fields, a few trees scattered like lonely watchers. Mei Lin looked around, holding her small shawl tightly. She had never seen land like this before. Back home, the air was filled with the sounds of people, animals, and rivers. Here it was wide, silent, and unknown. It scared her a little, but it was also beautiful in its own way. Jack didn't say much during the ride. He kept his eyes on the road ahead, but he could feel her presence beside him. It was strange. He had been alone on this road 1,000 times, and now there was someone sitting next to him. Someone who had left her entire world behind to start a new one here. He wondered what kind of courage that took. Mei Lin sat straight, trying not to let fear show on her face. She thought of her husband, gone 2 years now. She thought of the war and the hunger she had survived. She thought of her little boy who had died in the winter. She had no one left. When she saw an ad that promised a new life in a new land, she had taken the chance. She didn't know what waited for her, but staying behind meant nothing but more sorrow. The wagon rolled up to the ranch house just as the sun began to fall lower in the sky. The house was simple, a wooden structure with a porch, a barn to the left, and fields stretching out to the horizon. It wasn't big, but it was strong. It smelled like wood and hay, like a place that had seen years of hard work. Jack helped her down from the wagon. She stood in front of the house, her heart beating fast. This was it. This was her new home. She didn't know if she should feel grateful, scared, or both. "You'll have your own room," Jack said, breaking the silence. "Kitchen's inside. Water pump out back. It ain't fancy, but it's safe." She nodded, trying to understand every word. "Thank you," she said softly. He opened the door and let her step inside first. The room smelled faintly of soap and old wood. There was a table with 2 chairs, a small stove, and a few shelves. It was plain but cleaner than she expected. Jack had spent the past week scrubbing the floors, fixing broken boards, and making sure the spare room was ready. He didn't know why he cared so much, but something inside him wanted her to feel welcome. She placed her suitcase on the floor and looked around. This was the place where her new life would begin. She felt a strange mix of fear and hope rising in her chest. She had no idea who Jack really was or what kind of life waited here, but she knew one thing: she would not give up easily. She had come too far for that. Jack leaned against the doorframe, watching her. He could see the tiredness in her eyes, but also the quiet strength. He respected that. "You must be tired," he said. "I'll let you rest." As he turned to leave, Mei Lin's voice stopped him. "Jack," she said softly. He looked back. She hesitated, searching for the right words. "Thank you for bringing me." For a second, he didn't know how to respond. He just nodded once. "You're welcome." That night, Jack sat on the porch watching the stars. The air was cool, the world silent. But it didn't feel as lonely as before. Inside the house, a light burned softly in the spare room. He could hear the faint sound of movement, a reminder that he was no longer alone. Inside her room, Mei Lin lay on the small bed, her fingers touching the wooden frame. She thought of her old life, her lost family, the cold nights, the long road to this place. Tears filled her eyes, but they were quiet tears, not of weakness, but of memories. Tomorrow she would wake up in this new world. She didn't know if Jack would ever open his heart to her. She didn't know if she could ever find happiness again, but tonight she was safe. And for the first time in a long time, she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, a different life was possible. Outside, the stars shone brighter than she had ever seen. The ranch, once silent and empty, now held 2 hearts that carried heavy pasts and uncertain futures. Neither of them knew how their story would unfold. But both of them had taken a step, a small, brave step, into a life they had never imagined. And somewhere deep inside Jack's chest, behind the quiet walls he had built around his heart, a tiny spark of hope flickered to life. The first morning on the ranch came with soft light touching the wooden windows. A cool breeze passed through the cracks in the wall, making the curtain dance slowly. Mei Lin opened her eyes to a quiet world. For a moment she didn't remember where she was. Then, as her gaze met the old wooden ceiling and the smell of dry earth filled the air, she remembered this was her new home. Far from everything she had ever known, she sat up carefully. Her hands touched the edge of the small bed. The air was still a little cold, and she wrapped her shawl tightly around her shoulders. She walked to the small window and looked outside. The sun was rising over the fields, painting everything in shades of gold and soft brown. A few horses moved near the fence. She could hear a rooster far away. For a few seconds she stood there quietly. The beauty of the morning gave her a small sense of peace. Back home she used to rise early to prepare food and water for her family. Here the silence was different. It felt bigger, wider, and unfamiliar. But she told herself quietly, "I will learn this place. I will not give up." Jack was already outside. He had been awake long before the sun. That was the way life worked on the ranch. His boots crushed the dry grass as he checked the fences one by one, his hands steady, his mind already busy with the day's work. He wasn't sure how this new life with Mei Lin would fit into his quiet routine, but deep inside he felt a kind of energy he hadn't felt in years, something that made the empty fields seem a little less lonely. When Mei Lin stepped outside, she saw him near the barn. He turned when he heard her steps on the wooden porch. She was wearing the same simple dress with her hair tied neatly behind her. She looked small against the wide land, but there was a quiet strength in her posture. Jack raised his hat slightly as a greeting. "Morning," he said simply. She gave a small smile. "Good morning." He wasn't used to having someone answer his morning greeting. Usually it was just the sound of horses or the wind replying. The soft sound of her voice made something warm stir in his chest. "I made coffee," he said after a pause. "It's on the stove." She nodded. "Thank you." Inside the kitchen, Maylin poured herself a cup. The smell was strong, different from the tea she was used to back home. She took a small sip and winced a little at the bitterness, but she didn't complain. This was his world, and she had chosen to be part of it. Jack came inside soon after, wiping his hands with a cloth. He noticed her holding the cup carefully with both hands. She looked like a bird in a new cage, cautious but willing to learn. He pulled out a chair and sat across from her. For a moment, they just sat there, listening to the soft ticking of the stove. Jack wasn't good with words. He wanted to ask her about her journey, her life before coming here, her dreams. But he didn't know how to start. She seemed to sense his silence and didn't force conversation. Instead, she looked around the kitchen, observing everything. The old wooden shelves, the pots, the hanging lantern. Everything told her this was a place built by hands that worked hard for many years. After breakfast, Maylin followed Jack outside without him even asking. She saw the way he walked, steady, careful, as if every step had been taken 1,000 times before. He showed her the barn, the chicken coop, the water pump, and the fields. She didn't understand every word he said, but she watched closely, listening with her eyes as much as her ears. Jack didn't expect her to help. He thought she might need time to adjust, but to his surprise, she rolled up her sleeves and began to work. She helped carry water, fed the chickens, and swept the barn floor. Her movements were not perfect, but they were sincere. She didn't complain about the dirt or the sun. She worked silently with the same calm strength that lived in her eyes. Jack watched her from a distance. He was used to doing everything alone. Seeing someone moving beside him, even in silence, felt unusual. But it didn't feel wrong. It felt right. At noon, the sun was high and hot. Maylin wiped sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. Her hands were a little sore from the work, but she didn't stop. Jack finally walked over and said, "That's enough for today. You'll wear yourself out." She shook her head lightly. "I can work," she said softly. He looked at her for a moment. Her face was tired, but her spirit was strong. He let out a small breath and nodded. "All right, but don't push too hard." That afternoon, they sat on the porch together. Jack drank water from a tin cup, and Maylin sat quietly, her hands resting on her lap. The air smelled of dry hay and the distant river. "You work hard," he said suddenly. She turned to him, surprised by his words. "I used to work every day," she answered slowly. "Work makes the heart stay awake." He nodded, understanding more than she knew. Work had been the only thing that kept him going after losing so much. He respected her even more for that. In the following days, a soft rhythm began to form between them. Every morning, they woke up early. Jack fixed fences, fed animals, and checked the land. Maylin cooked, cleaned, and helped wherever she could. She didn't talk much, but when she did, her words were gentle and thoughtful. Jack, who had spent years with silence as his only friend, found himself listening to her voice like a quiet song. Sometimes, when the work was done, she would stand near the fence, watching the sunset. Jack would stand a few feet away, pretending to be checking something, but in truth, he was watching her too. There was something in the way she looked at the sky, as if she was searching for pieces of her old life in the colors of the evening. One evening, after a long day of work, Maylin cooked a simple soup with vegetables she found in the storage. The smell filled the small kitchen. Jack came inside, his hands dusty from fixing the gate. He stopped when he smelled the soup. For years, he had eaten plain bread and dried meat. The warmth of real food was something he had almost forgotten. She placed a bowl in front of him without many words. "Eat," she said softly. He sat down and tasted it. It was simple but full of flavor. Warmth spread through his chest, not just from the food but from the feeling that someone had cared enough to make it. "It's good," he said quietly. A small smile appeared on her lips. "I'm glad." They ate in silence, but it wasn't the kind of silence that felt empty. It was soft like a blanket over a cold night. Something unspoken was growing between them. Something fragile like the first green shoot pushing out of hard soil. Jack didn't know what this feeling meant. He had lived so long with walls around his heart that he wasn't sure how to let anyone in. Mei Lin, too, carried a heart that had known pain. Trust was not something she could give easily. But both of them, without even realizing it, had begun to build a small bridge between their quiet souls. One night, Mei Lin couldn't sleep. She stepped outside and walked to the fence. The stars above the ranch were bright, brighter than any stars she had seen before. The night air was cool and clear. She wrapped her shawl around herself and closed her eyes for a moment. Jack was sitting on the porch as he often did at night. He saw her standing by the fence, a small figure under the wide sky. He didn't speak at first. Then he walked toward her slowly. "Can't sleep?" he asked gently. She shook her head. "No, too many thoughts," he nodded, understanding. "Happens to me too." They stood side by side, not touching, not speaking much, just breathing the same quiet air. She looked at him from the corner of her eye. His face looked softer in the moonlight, less like stone and more like a man who had lived a hard life but still carried kindness deep inside. "Do you miss home?" he asked quietly. Her eyes glistened in the starlight. "Every day," she answered. "But I cannot go back, so I must make a new home here." He felt something stir in his chest again. Maybe this place can be home. "For both of us," he said, almost like he wasn't sure if he should. She looked at him for a long moment. She didn't reply, but her silence held a soft answer. She didn't fear him, and that was enough for now. As the night wind moved through the grass, the two of them stood there, two souls from different worlds, learning to share the same sky. The ranch was still quiet, but it was no longer just a lonely land. There was life in it now. There was hope, even if neither of them dared to say it out loud. When Mei Lin finally went back inside, Jack stayed for a little longer looking at the stars. For the first time in many years, he didn't feel like just a man surviving. He felt like a man living again. And deep inside Mei Lin's heart, where sorrow had once lived like a shadow, a tiny light began to glow. Not bright, not loud, but warm enough to hold on to. The warm days slowly turned into cooler mornings. The wind began to carry a soft chill that brushed against the skin like a gentle whisper. Life on the ranch moved at its steady rhythm. The horses needed care, the fences always needed mending, and the land asked for work every single day. But now the work didn't feel as lonely as it once did. Jack had grown used to seeing Mei Lin in the mornings. She would open the door quietly, her shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her eyes soft but alert. She would light the small stove, boil water for tea or coffee, and start the day without complaint. She was not just a guest anymore. She had become part of the place. One crisp morning, as the sun rose in a pale orange sky, Jack saddled his horse for the long ride to the north field. A storm earlier in the week had damaged part of the fence, and he needed to fix it before the cattle wandered off. Mei Lin stood at the porch watching him tie the rope tightly around the saddle. "Long ride?" she asked gently. He nodded. "A few hours there and back. Fence needs repair." She hesitated for a moment before saying softly, "I want to come." Jack looked at her with quiet surprise. He wasn't sure if she could handle the long ride through the fields. It wasn't easy. The path was rough and the work was heavy. "It's a long way," he said. "And it'll be hard work." She lifted her chin just a little. "I can help. I learn fast." He studied her face for a long second. She wasn't forcing or pleading. Her voice was calm but firm. He gave a small nod. "All right," he said finally. "But stay close." Mei Lin climbed onto the wagon beside him, holding onto the side rail as they moved down the dirt road. The wind blew through her hair, carrying with it the scent of grass and dust. She had never ridden so far out before. The field stretched endlessly in front of them, wide and quiet. She could see hills far away and small rivers shining in the morning light. Jack drove the wagon carefully. He didn't talk much, but every now and then he glanced at her. She sat straight, eyes wide, taking in everything around her. There was something about the way she looked at the land, with curiosity, not fear, that made something warm settle in his chest. When they reached the broken fence, Jack got down first. The wooden posts were cracked, some lying flat on the ground. He gathered his tools from the back of the wagon. Mei Lin stepped down too, brushing the dust from her dress. "I can help," she said again. He handed her a smaller hammer and pointed to the fallen posts. "Hold these steady. I'll set them in." She nodded seriously, her fingers closing around the wood. Jack worked with practiced hands, lifting, tightening, hammering. Maylin held each post carefully, keeping it steady as he drove the nails in. At first her hands were unsure, but slowly, her movements grew stronger. They worked side by side in quiet harmony. No big words, just the soft rhythm of wood, nails, and wind. Hours passed. The sun climbed high above them, but neither complained. When they finally finished, Jack straightened up and wiped his forehead with the back of his hand. The fence stood tall again, strong against the wind. Maylin's hands were a little red, but she felt a quiet pride rise inside her. "You did good," Jack said simply, looking at the fixed fence. She gave a small smile. "We did good." Those 3 words made something shift gently between them. Not loudly, not quickly, but deeply. Jack realized he liked hearing her say we. They sat under a tree nearby to rest, sharing a piece of bread and some water Jack had packed. Maylin chewed slowly, looking at the field. Jack leaned back against the tree trunk, his hat tilted slightly down to shield his eyes from the sun. "Where I come from," Maylin said softly. "We work together, always. No one is alone in the field." Jack tilted his head to look at her. "Sounds nice," he said. She nodded. "Yes, but the war took everything. Work, family, home. All gone." Her voice didn't shake, but her eyes held old pain. Jack didn't know how to fix something like that, but he understood what it meant to lose. He understood the kind of silence that follows loss. He didn't say, "I'm sorry." He simply sat with her in the quiet, letting the wind speak for both of them. Sometimes silence was stronger than words. When they returned to the ranch that evening, something felt different. The long ride and shared work had left an invisible bond between them. Jack felt it in the way she walked beside him, and Maylin felt it in the way he looked at her, not just as someone he brought here, but as someone who belonged. The following days flowed smoothly. Maylin became a steady part of every task. She learned to gather eggs without frightening the chickens, to help mend broken tools, to bring warm water when Jack returned from the fields. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living. And little by little, the house began to change too. The once quiet kitchen now smelled of warm food in the evenings. A small vase with wildflowers Maylin picked from the field sat on the table. A cloth she sewed herself covered a crack on the window. Jack noticed these changes even if he didn't always speak about them. The ranch felt warmer, lighter, less like a place of memories and more like a place of new beginnings. One evening after dinner, Jack was sitting on the porch, sharpening a small tool. Maylin came outside and sat on the step below him. The sky above was painted with deep pink and soft orange. The world was quiet except for the sound of crickets waking for the night. "Jack," she said softly. He looked down at her, his hands still moving slowly on the tool. "Yes? Why do you live alone?" she asked carefully, not out of curiosity but out of quiet care. He hesitated. He hadn't talked about his past in a long time. "Used to have a family," he said at last. "Parents. This ranch was theirs. After they were gone, it was just me. There was a woman once. I thought we'd build a life together here. But she chose another man." Maylin lowered her gaze. She could hear the quiet ache in his voice, the kind that didn't come from fresh wounds but from old ones that never fully faded. "I stopped expecting much after that," he continued. "Just work the land. It's easier to keep quiet than to lose again." She didn't say anything right away. Then she whispered, "You are not alone now." Her words were simple, but they settled deep in his heart. He didn't reply, but his hand stopped moving for a moment. The evening breeze carried her words softly around them, like a promise that didn't need to be shouted. In the weeks that followed, the bond between them grew quietly. Maylin started humming softly when she worked, and Jack began noticing the way his heart felt lighter when she smiled. They still spoke little, but the silence between them wasn't empty anymore. It was full of shared work, shared meals, shared moments. One Sunday morning, Jack decided to take Maylin into town. She hadn't been back since she arrived. Her eyes lit up with a mix of nervousness and excitement as they rode the wagon down the long road. The town was small but lively. Children ran down the street. Shopkeepers called out friendly greetings, and the smell of bread filled the air. People turned to look at them. Some smiled. Others whispered quietly to each other. Maylin felt their eyes on her, but she stood tall. She wasn't the frightened woman from the train platform anymore. She was stronger now. She walked beside Jack, her steps steady. Jack bought supplies, nails, rope, some flour, and then they stopped at a small general store. The woman behind the counter smiled kindly at Mei Lin. "First time in town?" she asked. Mei Lin nodded. "Yes." Jack noticed how Mei Lin's English had grown better. She spoke slowly but clearly now. The woman offered her a small piece of candy, and Mei Lin's face lit up like a child's. Jack felt something warm stir inside him at the sight of that smile. On the ride back to the ranch, Mei Lin held the small piece of candy in her hand, almost as if it was something precious. Jack watched her, a faint smile hidden beneath the brim of his hat. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" he asked. "For today. For everything," she replied. He didn't know how to answer something like that, so he just nodded. But inside something grew stronger. A feeling that maybe, just maybe, the ranch wasn't just his anymore. It was theirs. That night, as they sat by the soft light of the lantern, Mei Lin looked around the small house. The wind outside was cool, but inside the air felt warm. She thought about how far she had come, about the nights she had felt lost and broken. Now there was still sorrow in her heart, but it was no longer the only thing she felt. She also felt peace. Jack leaned back in his chair, looking at her without realizing it. She had brought something into his life he hadn't known he needed. Quiet companionship. Not the loud, dramatic kind, but the soft, steady kind that made the world feel less heavy. In that moment, as the lantern light flickered softly, both of them sat in silence. But the silence spoke clearly. It said, "You are not alone anymore." And neither of them wanted to change that. The wind changed as autumn slowly touched the land. The air grew cooler, the sky clearer, and the evenings arrived earlier. Golden light fell softly over the fields, making everything glow like warm honey. The ranch, which had once felt like a lonely island, now held two souls who had found a quiet rhythm together. Each day began with the same early morning light, the same work, but something about it felt different. Jack no longer walked through the fields feeling the heavy weight of silence. Now there was always a second pair of footsteps beside him, light, steady, and sure. Mei Lin had become a part of every corner of the ranch. She didn't just live there. She belonged there. The neighbors in town had started to notice too. Jack, the quiet man who had kept to himself for years, now came to town with a woman who walked proudly by his side. She didn't speak much, but when she smiled, it reached her eyes. People whispered softly, but it didn't bother either of them. What mattered most was the small, warm world they were building together, brick by brick, day by day. One morning, a thick fog covered the ranch. Jack and Mei Lin stood on the porch holding mugs of warm tea. The fields looked like they had disappeared into the mist. The sound of a few horses moving slowly came from somewhere in the distance. "It looks like the world is sleeping," Mei Lin said softly. Jack looked at her profile, the soft fog wrapping around her like a painting. "Yeah," he said. "But the work doesn't sleep." She laughed lightly, a sound Jack had come to love. It was gentle and warm, like sunlight after a long storm. They walked out together, their boots crunching on the cold ground. Jack showed her how to move slowly in the fog, how to listen for the horses instead of just looking for them. She followed closely, her steps confident now. The horses moved toward them as if they had accepted her as part of the ranch too. Jack tied the ropes carefully, and Mei Lin whispered to the animals in a soft voice. They responded calmly to her touch. Jack noticed how the horses trusted her. It was the same way the land seemed to have slowly accepted her. She had come as a stranger, but now the ranch felt incomplete without her. Later that day, Jack worked on repairing the barn roof while Mei Lin prepared food inside the house. She had started learning new recipes from a kind woman in town who liked her gentle manners. The smell of soup and fresh bread filled the house. Jack, wiping sweat from his forehead, caught the scent even from outside. It reminded him of something he hadn't felt in a long time, the comfort of a real home. When he came inside, his hands still dusty from work, Mei Lin set a bowl on the table. "Eat," she said simply. Jack sat down. He wasn't a man of fancy words, but he always made sure to look at her before taking the first bite, as if to say thank you without speaking. She understood his quiet ways by now. She had learned to read his silence, and he had learned to trust hers. That evening, they sat together on the porch. The fog had lifted, and the stars had returned to their quiet places above. The soft orange light from the lantern warmed the porch, while the night wind carried a soft chill. Jack leaned back in his chair, tired but at peace. Mei Lin wrapped her shawl around herself and watched the stars. "I used to watch stars with my son," she said softly, her voice carrying both memory and love. Jack turned his head slightly toward her. She rarely spoke of her past, and when she did, it was always with great care. "He liked to count them," she continued. "He always said the stars were the eyes of heaven watching over us. Every night he would fall asleep before he reached the end." Jack didn't interrupt. He just listened because he knew how much trust it took to open old wounds. "I lost him," she whispered. "But when I look at the stars here, it feels like he can see me. Even from far away," Jack swallowed softly. He had no words that could ease that kind of loss. But he didn't try to offer empty comfort. Instead, he said quietly, "Then I'm glad the stars here are bright." She looked at him with wet eyes but gave a small, grateful smile. He hadn't tried to fix her pain. He had simply stood with her in it. Sometimes that was enough. The next few weeks passed with small, gentle changes. Jack started building a new fence on the east side of the ranch, and Mei Lin helped him every step of the way. She brought him water when he worked, learned how to cut the wood just right, and even surprised him by fixing a small section on her own one afternoon, when he saw her standing there with sawdust in her hair and a proud little smile on her face. Something inside his chest warmed like sunlight after a long winter. "You're getting good at this," he said. She laughed softly. "I learn from the best." Jack shook his head with a shy grin and got back to work. But inside, he felt something new, a quiet happiness he hadn't known he still had in him. The neighbors sometimes came by to buy eggs or milk, and they often left talking about how different Jack seemed now. He smiled more, even if only a little. His voice was softer. The house looked brighter. It was no longer the lonely ranch of a quiet man. It was slowly becoming a home. One afternoon, Jack and Mei Lin went to the small creek at the edge of the property to fetch water. The air was crisp and yellow leaves floated on the surface of the water. Mei Lin knelt down to touch it, feeling its coldness run through her fingers. Jack stood behind her, holding the bucket. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "Yeah," Jack answered, looking not at the creek, but at her. He didn't say it out loud, but he had started seeing beauty in many things since she came, things he had stopped noticing long ago. They carried the bucket back together, talking softly about little things and about the neighbors, about the horses, about the way the wind changed in autumn. Their conversations were never loud, but they were always warm. It wasn't the kind of connection built on grand promises. It was built on everyday kindness. That night, a storm arrived unexpectedly. The wind howled around the house and rain tapped against the windows like impatient fingers. Jack checked the barn twice to make sure the animals were safe. Mei Lin waited by the door holding a lantern. When he returned, dripping with rain, she handed him a towel without a word. He dried himself as she stirred the fire in the stove, making the small kitchen warm. The sound of the storm outside only made the room feel more like a safe shelter. Jack sat down and Mei Lin poured him a cup of warm tea. Their eyes met briefly, a quiet exchange that said more than words ever could. The storm grew louder and the house creaked a little under the weight of the wind. Mei Lin wrapped her shawl tightly and sat near the fire. Jack sat across from her. For a long moment, neither spoke. They just listened to the rain together. "I used to be afraid of storms," Mei Lin said softly. "When the wind was loud, I thought the world would end. But here, it feels different." Jack leaned back slightly. "Because you're not alone anymore," he said. She lifted her eyes slowly to meet his. His words weren't decorated with fancy phrases. They were simple, honest, and warm. She nodded slowly. "Yes, not alone." As the storm raged outside, something quiet and strong grew between them. It wasn't spoken out loud. It didn't need to be. It was in the way they shared the same small space, in the way the warmth of the fire reflected in their eyes, and in the way their hearts had slowly learned to trust again. The storm passed by morning, leaving behind a wet and shining world. The fields were soaked, the air smelled fresh, and drops of water hung from the fence like tiny crystals. Jack and Mei Lin stepped outside together, breathing in the cool air. The ranch had survived another storm, just like they had survived their own in the past. Jack turned to her, his hat pulled low, his eyes soft. "You did well," he said. She looked at him puzzled. "I did nothing. You stayed," he said simply. "That matters." She didn't answer right away, but her heart beat a little faster. Sometimes it wasn't about grand actions. Sometimes Just being there was enough. That evening, when they sat on the porch again, Mei Lin rested her hands on the railing and looked out at the golden fields. Jack sat beside her, quiet as always. But now their silence was filled with something warm and real. It wasn't just two people sitting near each other. It was two lives slowly becoming one story. Mei Lin thought of her old home, of the pain and losses that had once made her heart heavy. But now when she looked at the land, she didn't just see a strange country anymore. She saw a place where she could belong, a place where she was wanted, a place where she wasn't invisible. And Jack, who had spent years in quiet solitude, felt something shift inside him too. He no longer saw her as a stranger who had arrived from far away. He saw her as part of the land, part of his days, part of his heart. Neither of them said the words out loud. They didn't need to. Some bonds grow in silence, stronger than words ever could. The sun set behind the fields, painting the world in soft orange. Two figures sat side by side on the porch, surrounded by the quiet beauty of a place they now shared. And in that simple moment, they both knew something had changed forever. Winter arrived gently that year. The mornings were cold and still, with mist hanging over the fields like a soft white blanket. Frost sparkled on the fence posts and the horses huffed small clouds of warm air into the sky. The ranch, which once felt like a quiet, distant place, now carried the warmth of two lives woven together over time. Mei Lin wrapped herself in a thick shawl as she stepped outside. The ground crunched softly beneath her boots. She looked up at the pale winter sun and smiled. She had grown used to this land now. What had once been unfamiliar and wide now felt like home. She knew the sounds of every corner of the ranch, the creak of the porch floorboards, the low call of the horses, the soft rustle of the wind against the barn walls. Inside, Jack stoked the fire, watching the flames dance in the old stove. He had lived through many winters alone in this house. In those years, the cold had felt endless, the silence heavier than snow. But this winter was different. The house no longer echoed with emptiness. Mei Lin's soft steps, her quiet humming, and the way she brought small touches of warmth into every room made the place feel alive. Jack walked outside, pulling his jacket close. Mei Lin was standing by the fence, watching the horses. He walked up beside her. She turned slightly, her cheeks pink from the cold, her breath forming small clouds in the air. "Cold?" he asked. "A little," she said, smiling softly. He handed her a small woolen scarf he had kept folded in his pocket. It wasn't new, but it was warm. She accepted it carefully, wrapping it around her neck. Their eyes met for a moment, and though neither said anything, the silence between them was full of meaning. They went about their work as usual. Jack repaired the gate that had loosened in the last storm, while Mei Lin carried water from the well. She had become strong over the months. Her steps were steady, her hands firm. She no longer moved like a guest trying to stay out of the way. She moved like someone who belonged. Later, they returned to the house to warm themselves by the fire. Mei Lin prepared warm soup with vegetables and soft bread. Jack sat at the table, watching her move with quiet grace. When she handed him the bowl, their hands brushed slightly. Neither pulled away. The days passed quietly but beautifully. Each day was filled with small tasks that meant more than either of them said out loud. Mei Lin would tidy the house, mend clothes, and take care of the animals while Jack worked on the land. But what made each moment special wasn't the work itself. It was the way they shared it. One evening, as snow began to fall softly outside, Jack sat near the window, sharpening a tool. Mei Lin stood beside the stove, sewing a small tear in his coat. The snowflakes drifted slowly through the air like tiny feathers, and the house glowed softly with lantern light. "Snow is beautiful," she said quietly, looking out the window. Jack lifted his eyes from the tool. "It is, but it makes work harder," she smiled. "But also quieter, softer." He looked out at the snow again. He had lived here his whole life, but he had never really seen winter like this before. It had always been something to endure, to survive. Now, with her beside him, the same snow felt peaceful. As the night grew darker, the snowfall became heavier. Mei Lin placed the coat aside and walked to the window. Jack joined her. Together, they watched the world turn white. Their reflections shimmered faintly on the glass. Two people who had walked very different roads but had found their way to the same place. "You ever miss the city?" Jack asked quietly. She shook her head slowly. "No, I miss people I love. But I don't miss the place here. I can breathe," Jack nodded. He understood. The land, with all its silence, had a way of healing broken things slowly, not with loud promises but with quiet patience. The next morning, the ranch was covered in snow. Jack stepped outside first, breaking the thin layer of ice on the water trough. Maylin followed, wrapped in her scarf. She laughed softly when she saw the way the snow rested on the fence like white icing. They worked together to clear the paths. She shoveled carefully, laughing when her boots sank into the soft snow. Jack found himself smiling more than usual as he watched her. She looked at the snow with wonder, as if every snowflake carried a small piece of magic. After the work, they sat on the porch with 2 steaming mugs of tea. The sky was a soft silver, and the land seemed to stretch forever. Maylin leaned slightly against the porch railing. "When I came here," she said softly, "I was scared every day. Everything was new. I didn't know if I could live here." Jack turned to her slowly. "But now," she continued, "I feel like the land knows my name." Her words were simple, but they touched something deep inside him. Jack looked out at the fields. For years he had felt like a shadow moving through this place, working it, living on it, but never really belonging to it. But now with her it felt like more than a ranch. It felt like a shared world. That night a small group of neighbors came by with fresh bread and candles. They had started visiting more often over the last few months. Maylin welcomed them kindly, offering warm soup and smiles. The small house filled with soft voices and laughter. Jack sat quietly, but even he couldn't stop the faint smile from touching his face. When the neighbors left, Maylin closed the door gently, her face still glowing from the warmth of the visit. Jack stood near the table, looking at her quietly. "You've changed this house," he said. She looked at him surprised. "How?" "It used to be quiet," he said slowly, "cold, like a place only meant for work. But now—" He paused, searching for the right words. "Now it feels like a home." Her eyes softened. She didn't need to ask more. She understood. Winter passed slowly, wrapping the ranch in a soft, quiet beauty. Jack and Maylin grew closer not through grand gestures, but through the hundreds of small things they shared each day. Fixing fences, feeding the animals, laughing when the kettle whistled too loud, sitting in silence by the fire. One morning, when the snow began to melt and the sun returned to the land, they stood side by side on the porch. The ground was still damp, but the air smelled fresh, like the beginning of something new. Maylin closed her eyes and let the breeze touch her face. Jack watched her for a long moment. "You've changed me too," he said quietly. She opened her eyes slowly and looked at him. "How?" He took a slow breath. "I thought I'd be alone forever. I thought that was my life. But you came, and now it doesn't feel empty anymore." For a moment, neither moved. The wind passed gently through the open fields. Maylin's heart filled with quiet emotion. She had come here as a stranger with nothing but a small suitcase and a wounded heart. She had been unsure if she would ever truly belong again. But now, this place, this man, and this simple life had wrapped themselves around her like a warm blanket on a cold night. Jack wasn't a man of fancy speeches, but every word he spoke carried weight. Like a stone laid carefully in a strong foundation, she gave him a soft smile and whispered, "And you gave me a place to stand again." Spring arrived soon after. The snow melted completely and the fields bloomed with soft green. Flowers appeared near the fence and birds returned to sing in the mornings. The ranch was alive again, not just with work, but with joy. Maylin planted small flowers near the porch. Jack built a small wooden bench beside it. Every evening they sat together watching the sunset over the land they now shared. Neither needed to speak much. The quiet between them was no longer empty. It was full of everything they had lived through together. Jack often thought back to the day he had seen her for the first time at the train station, a small woman with dark hair and uncertain eyes. She had seemed fragile then, but now as he looked at her beside him, he saw someone strong, steady, and full of quiet courage. And Maylin often thought of that same day too, when she had stepped off the train not knowing what her future would hold. She had lost everything back home, but this land, this man, had given her something she thought she'd never have again. A life that felt whole. As the last light of the day painted the sky in soft gold, Jack leaned back on the bench. Maylin rested her hands on her lap. The horses moved slowly in the fields, and the warm wind brushed past their faces. The world felt still and peaceful. Two lives, once broken and alone, had found their way to each other without loud words or promises. Just shared days, small kindnesses, and quiet trust. And in that soft spring evening, as the sun slipped behind the hills, neither of them felt like they were living separate lives anymore. Their story, which had begun with uncertainty, now lived in every corner of that ranch, in the land, the house, and their hearts. They didn't need to say it out loud. Both of them already knew. They had built something real,